it's a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak to the leaders of the Florida United Methodist Church and to anyone else who's listening in here at any point in time. To talk about the Israel-Palestine issue is incredibly fraught to begin with. We're living in a time where we're deeply polarized, and I would advise people, by the way, to consider who benefits from us being polarized. Certainly not us, we the people, and certainly not Palestinians, and certainly not Israelis would benefit from us being deeply polarized on that issue. I would also point out that this is not a new problem. It's one that goes back generations, perhaps we could even say goes back thousands of years. If you are going to accept the text of the Hebrew Bible as historically accurate, or even an indication of what happened in antiquity, this is a family argument. So there are first cousins who are in strife with each other, actually brothers who are in strife with each other, if we go back to Esau and Jacob. And that has been the history of the region for the intervening millennia. The serious conflict came into being well over 100 years ago. And that had more to do with who was running the show in that region of the world than it did about the people who were actually there. The populations were comparatively small. There's always been a Jewish population of some kind in what is now the state of Israel, going back to at least documented back to the time of when King David would have been there. And there's also been people who are from other descendants who have lived in the area since that time. For most of that time, there was occasional conflict, but the folks shared that region with a fair amount of civility between each other. And again, some of that had to do with the size of the population. Some of that had to do with how the population was distributed. In modern times, and by modern times, I'm saying the modern era, so starting with the Industrial Revolution, there was a shift. And a lot of times what's pointed to is European colonialism. So I'm going to pause here for a moment and define what colonialism is and what colonialism is not. So if you're a colonial power back in those days, and this is going back to the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century as well, the heyday of European colonialism, you were a sovereign state, and you were sending your people out to areas of the world where you didn't have any sovereignty. In fact, you probably knew very little about them, to establish colonies and claim that land as part of the sovereign state. So when British colonialists came to North America, they were claiming areas of North America as part of the British Empire. That's probably the story that Americans know best. So colonialism is starting from a center point and branching out to places where you didn't used to live. Okay. The other word that gets thrown around is Zionism. And Zionism as a political movement arises in the late 19th century. That is, in a way, the exact opposite of what colonialism is. The Zionist idea was that Jews were a scattered and disempowered people. They had no sovereignty. They had no self-determination. And what would be safest for Jews in the world, who could be uprooted at any time, who could be oppressed at any time, who could be, in many cases, wantonly abused and murdered, was to gather them together in a single spot where they could have self-determination and sovereignty. So colonialism, sovereign nation, goes out, claims other parts of the world as part of their sovereign nation. Zionism, disenfranchised people brought together in one place and establishing self-determination and sovereignty there. So kind of the opposite process. The other thing to know about the Zionist idea was that it wasn't invented in the 19th century. That the ingathering of exiles, that idea that is the core of Zionism, the ingathering of exiles is something which is part of Jewish theology and part of the daily Jewish liturgy going back onto the early centuries of the Common Era. So easily 1600 years before the founding of the modern Zionist movement in the 19th century, Jews were praying 3 times a day traditionally for the return and the ingathering of exiles, a return to homeland. So it's an aspiration which has been part of Jewish history since there's been Jewish history, pretty much, since the major expulsion of Jews from the area which is now the state of Israel in roughly the 2nd century of the Common Era. So that brings me to my next point, which is when we discuss Israel and Palestine, we often fall back on historical arguments. And ultimately, those end up not being helpful because a historical argument is only helpful for whoever decides when they want to start counting history. And so many times we will hear about the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, which happened at the end of the 1967 war in Israel. And that was indeed the beginning of a problem because Israel found itself in possession of territory that it was not in possession of before. And we'll also hear people talk about the Geneva Conventions and the International Committee of the Red Cross and international law and how Israel has an obligation to return those captured territories. That is true under the Geneva Conventions, and Israel did return the Sinai to Egypt because it was part of Egypt's sovereign territory before the 1967 war. Important sidebar, Israel also tried to return Gaza to Egypt after when they returned the Sinai, and Egypt declined to accept it because they said it was not part of their sovereign territory, that they had a military government that was in Gaza, and it was still Israel's responsibility. So Israel did try and give Gaza back to Egypt, and Egypt declined. The problem with the West Bank is there was no sovereign state that was recognized as having sovereignty over that region. Jordan claimed it, but other members of the what was then the Arab League did not recognize Jordan's claim. So there wasn't anybody to give it back to. The Geneva Conventions say you have to return it to the sovereign nation that had it before the armed conflict, and there wasn't one. So that was part of the plan of creating a Palestinian state. Was if we create a Palestinian state, there would now be a sovereign nation established, and Israel could hand Gaza and the West Bank to that sovereign nation. That's the two-state solution. That hasn't really made it very far. We got close a couple of times, but that has just not happened. So starting in 1967 is already, if we're counting history from there, it's already problematic because yes, Israel is occupying territories, but one they tried to give back and the sovereign nation wouldn't take it, and the other one doesn't have a sovereign nation to give it back to. That doesn't mean there's not a solution. That means that the standard solution you would do at the end of an armed conflict isn't possible here. All right. Some people say we can go back to 1948 and the establishment of the state of Israel, and that was established by the United Nations. It was imposed on the region. Yes, it was established by the United Nations. It was the decolonization by the British. The British had the United Nations mandate in the region. The French had certain parts of the Middle East as well. They picked up those territories with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And so, yes, it's true that the borders of the state of Israel were drawn by an international body, but that's also true for most all of the nations in the Middle East that used to be part of the Ottoman Empire or were under the colonial rule of England or France or another colonial power. So all of our borders are drawn by human beings. They're not they were not divinely established in the last several hundred years. So that's problematic as well. And we can keep going back from there. So by and large, the historical argument doesn't move us forward. By definition, history is what happened already, and we can't change it. So if we're going to talk about resolution of the issues in Israel and Palestine, the historical analysis is important in understanding how we got to where we are, but is not really helpful in moving us forward towards a resolution. The other thing that is unhelpful in my view is speaking of the current situation, or even the recent past, and by recent I mean the last century or so, in terms of other things that have happened in other places of the world. So using words like apartheid or Holocaust are in my view not helpful, because apartheid was something that happened in South Africa in a very particular set of circumstances and had a particular meaning there. It was set up by the South African government, the white South African government, the minority white South African government, to supposedly bring the Black population up to speed culturally and technologically. It was used instead as a way of keeping them isolated, and it was a very abusive and very brutal regime. Black South Africans had very little in the way of rights or protection. We can draw some parallels, but to call it apartheid is misleading in one way, and it's also, in my view, is also somewhat disrespectful to those who did actually experience apartheid. Likewise with saying Holocaust. Holocaust, the Holocaust with a capital H, is an historical event that's associated with a particular place and time, and particular groups that were targeted for extinction. And again, those are historical events, and we can learn things from those historical events, and we should. But if we start naming something that's happening now according to those historical events, we're not moving towards resolution. And that's really the main focus that I have. And calling people Nazis or making other historical comparisons rhetorically is very effective. It stirs people's emotions, but does it actually bring the parties closer to reconciliation and peace and justice? I don't think it does. So I think that kind of language is unhelpful as well. So what is helpful? I would say, if we're going to talk about this volatile situation, there are two things that have to happen. The first thing is something that I learned from reading a book by Yossi Klein Halevi, which is called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. And in this book, Yossi imagines that he is sending a letter to someone on the other side of the border in the West Bank, in an Arab village, and he's explaining his own narrative and acknowledging that other person's narrative. And Yossi actually had these 10 letters translated into Arabic and placed on the internet so that anybody could get it. And he got a response from an academic who is actually in the U.S. now, named Walid Issa. And he answered the letters, and they actually toured the United States on a book tour and had this conversation. The gist of the book is, and the gist of that tour was, we have to listen to each other's narratives, and we have to understand that my narrative is my identity. And if you're going to tell me that part of your narrative is wrong and you have to abandon it, you have to change it, or you have to bring it in line with my narrative, you're asking me to surrender a piece of my identity, and that's very, very unlikely to happen. So what do we do instead? we listen to each other's narratives, and we say to each other, I understand and I accept that your narrative is valid for you, even though there are things that I disagree with, or we are complete opposites on. So I need to listen to the Palestinian narrative to understand where it's coming from and where those folks are coming from. Likewise, Palestinians need to listen to the Israeli narrative, or to the broader Jewish national narrative, and understand that where that's coming from. And we both need to be able to say, you know what, I understand why you call it Nakba. Do you understand why I call it Israel Independence Day? And can we both accept that those conflicting narratives are valid for each other? If we can, we've got a place to start, because we've humanized the other. It's not just, you're not just somebody who is my enemy. You are somebody who has your own narrative and your own identity, and you feel as strongly and passionately and as protective about your narrative and your identity as I do about mine. Now we've got a place to start. The other element that I think the vast numbers of people can agree on, deep in their heart of hearts, is that we'd like to just live our lives. I had a chance. This was a few years back. I was on a special program. We did a tour across the political spectrum in Israel, and we actually went to Ramallah, to the Palestinian Authority headquarters, and spoke with Saeb Erekat, who was one of the leaders of the Palestinian Authority, since passed away. But it was a remarkable moment for a group of, we were 20 rabbis of different denominations and backgrounds, sitting around a table in the West Bank, in the capital of the West Bank, in the headquarters of the Palestinian authorities, speaking with this person who had been a spokesperson and negotiator and leader of the Palestinian Authority for decades. It was really a wonderful moment, because we were actually sitting in somebody else's living room and hearing them speak about their identity. So what we heard, or what I heard, among lots of political things for sure, but what I heard from Palestinians during that trip was, really, we would just like to live our lives and do our work and raise our children, and and feel safe and happy in life, and that's pretty much what we all want. So that is a fundamental point of agreement, and I think, given their druthers, most of us on the planet, let alone in areas of conflict, would just like to do that. It's the most important thing is our lives and our happiness and our families, and our communities, and we'd like to just be left alone to do that, and be supported in doing that as well. The last point that I really want to make is trying to talk about, when we're talking about solutions, is one state, two state solution, and the chant that we hear, which is very triggering for Israelis and many Jews worldwide, of from the river to the sea. What's between the river and the sea, the river being the Jordan River, the sea being the Mediterranean, is the current state of Israel for the most part, including the West Bank and including Gaza. So what is heard by Israelis and what's heard by Jews around the world, of liberating between the river and the sea, sounds like, even if it's not intended like that, and in some cases it may be intended like that, that the state of Israel disappears, and it becomes a Palestinian state, and Jews can either stay or go or do whatever they want. And the more recent history, and again, more recent, I'm talking about the last couple of centuries. The more recent history of Jews living in Muslim states has not been a pleasant one, and that's not something that that Jews and Israelis would look forward to. So it's a deep concern. One state solution can work if it's a one state solution that's more like the United States, where you have individual states, they run their own business, individual areas, but everybody is a citizen of the broader the broader republic. There's written into a constitution, there's protection for minorities, whoever the minorities might happen to be. A two-state solution could work if the boundaries can be drawn in a way that's considered to be equitable and agreeable, and also in a way that in a way that's secure for all parties involved. Both of those are very, very tall orders and very difficult. And the other consideration is the current state of Israel, excuse me, was established as a Jewish homeland. It's a safe haven for Jews from around the world. And if you turn it into a secular democracy, does it maintain that protection for Jews who may be under oppression elsewhere in the world? So those are the challenges in discussing it. The current conflict is something that has its roots in all of that. It has its roots in those disagreements. It has its roots in those conflicting narratives. However, it also was immediately triggered by an inexcusable act of violence against civilians. The response from Israel is devastating. The last thing that I saw from more reliable sources is that perhaps half of the population of Gaza has been dislodged and does not have safe and permanent shelter. There's arguments about the numbers of civilian casualties in Gaza, but they are clearly in the thousands. That's horrific. The suffering is real. The humanitarian crisis is real. The challenge we have there is how do you resolve that in a way that guarantees security and safety for citizens in Gaza and on the Israel side of the border? Hamas has a very clear goal, which is the elimination of the state of Israel, and has said very clearly through its leadership that what happened on October 7th will continue to happen again and again if they're given the opportunity. Israel has a moral obligation and a legal obligation as a sovereign state to protect its citizens and to remove the source of threat to the safety and lives of their citizens. How do you do that in a densely populated, predominantly urban area without causing casualties? I wish there were a good answer to that. If we can step away, and I know it's very difficult, but if we can step away from the human cost for just a moment, because I don't want to stay away from the human cost for very long at all. But if we step away for just a moment, here is a threat. I think we could agree that removing that threat is important, because that threat is not only endangering the lives of Israelis, but also endangering the lives of Palestinians and making their lives less than they could be. This was a government that was voted in by the people, the citizens of Gaza, but there hasn't been a free election since, and it's been years and years now, and there's no indication of that there's going to be one. So there's autocratic rule there. And those decisions that impact the lives and health and safety of Palestinians are being made for them by a government that they haven't had a voice in for years and years. Now, that doesn't excuse loss of life, but it does frame how complex this is. It would be wonderful if there was an easy answer to this, and to say these guys are the bad guys, these guys are the good guys. The good guys have to beat the bad guys, or the world has to tell the bad guys to stop, and let the good guys prevail. It's very, very difficult to sort all that out in such a complicated situation. So when we talk about the current war going on right now, it's virtually impossible, in my view, to make it a question of absolutes. Israelis themselves, we have to recall, were pouring into the streets in the tens of thousands to protest the current government prior to this event, prior to the start of this war. We've also gotten information very recently that it wasn't an intelligence failure on Israel's part, October 7th, I'm referring to. There was plenty of intelligence coming in. People were saying, look, stuff is going on here. They're doing military exercises, Hamas is, and the intelligence that was available described a possibility very much like what happened on October 7th. And it got ignored by higher ups in the channels. So there's a serious problem within the Israeli government itself. It's not representative of the people, and it has behaved in a way that resulted in this horrible conflagration. We have to be willing to say the same thing about the Palestinian leadership as well. Hamas only got into power in Gaza because Fatah in the Palestinian Authority, which rules the West Bank, or has authority in the West Bank, was considered too corrupt. And so given the choice of two evils, they chose the one that said, we can protect you militarily. So making an absolute statement is, it's not even about whether it's possible, because it's certainly possible. People are doing it all the time. But I think in reality, making an absolute statement is, at the very least, is misleading, and is probably better understood as being clouding the issue completely. The focus that we should have, in my view, is on the loss of life, and how do we prevent that, and how do we stop it. It's been pointed out that that Israel has the bigger guns and the larger military, and has the jets and all the technology, and could stop the airstrikes immediately, and that would stop the civilian casualties. It's absolutely true. On the other hand, Hamas could release the rest of the hostages and say, we're going to stop fighting, and we retract saying that we're going to keep doing October 7th until you don't exist anymore, and we can sit down and talk. So belligerents in this case are both able to take steps to reduce and eventually, and hopefully quickly, stop the violence and stop the killing.